One common question I get asked a lot is how I choose my camera settings for my landscape photos. So in today's video, I'm sharing how I select the right settings whilst on location. Welcome back, and I've got a couple of nice locations to shoot at today, and I thought it'd be great to discuss how I select my camera settings when I'm out in the field. It's a question I get asked a lot, and hopefully it might be helpful to you next time you're out and about shooting some landscapes. So I've got set straight up today for my first shot. It's a super simple little composition. So I'm going to grab this one and then we'll go to the next location and get stuck into today's video. So I often think that it can be very easy to let camera settings get in the way of creativity. It's for this reason that I never think about camera settings until I've actually found a composition and pre-visualised the final photo in my mind. For me, this is the most important part of taking the photo. The camera and the settings are just there to capture what I have in mind at the time. So I think it's really important not to let settings get in the way of creativity. That being said though, obviously once we have pre-visualized the actual shot, settings then become very important, because if we're not able to make the camera record the image as we want it, then the overall shot will become a failure. So to make it easier, I've broken my approach down into 4 simple steps that I always go through when I take a landscape photo. So my first step is always pre-visualizing the image before anything else. So we're at the edge of the Brecon Beacons today in waterfall country, and I absolutely love shooting landscapes here. It's always great, it's always good fun. Hopefully we'll come out with a couple of good images today. Quite like that first one. Some early signs of autumn creeping in as well, which is always good, always complements the waterfalls here. There's been a fair bit of rain about over the last few days as well, so there should be a fair bit of flow coming through the falls. So let's get on up to this next location, which I haven't been to before, but I think is going to be a cracker. Ooh, wasn't expecting a hill walk. Happy days. Back down we go. So this is the location. It looks absolutely incredible, I have to say. I'm not sure if I'm going to shoot it from up here or not, but I think there's a better viewpoint a little bit further around, and then we might even see if we can try and get down the bottom there, although it does look quite slippery. But yeah, wow, this looks incredible. Somebody's put some tree roots in the right place for us, which is nice. Whew. So I think I've got my shot framed up. So the second step I like to run through is depth of field and aperture. And once I have my pre-visualised shot in my head, I'll frame up the scene and tackle the all-important issue, which is depth of field. Now, if you're not familiar with depth of field, it's the distance between the closest and the furthest objects in a photo that appear acceptably sharp. Now, depending on the pre-visualised scene, we may want a certain part of the image to be sharp or the whole image to be sharp, and the aperture along with our point of focus will control this for us. And that's why I always start with my aperture settings. Now, the aperture will be different depending on the required depth of field. So there's not a one setting does all scenario. It's something that needs to be figured out when you're in front of the camera and in front of your scene. For this particular scene, I want everything to be sharp from front to back. So I've taken a few test shots and I can see that I need an aperture of f11 to get this to work. If I focus about 1/3 of the way into the shot, I'm totally happy to shoot at f11, and this lens is nice and sharp between f5.6 and f11, so that's great. If I stop down any further, things get a little soft, but for this scenario it works perfectly. If my foreground was closer, then I might need to focus stack to get everything sharp, but for this shot it's fine. And by the way, if you're not sure about focus stacking, I've done a video on that which I'll leave in the video description for you to take a look at. So what an absolutely incredible location this is, just breathtaking. The footbridge there, the waterfall flowing underneath it. And then we've got this wonderful sort of cascade running through the image. We've got a natural S-curve, which is always very, very pleasing. And what I've done, I've got the tripod really, really low here. And that's because the central pool is quite large. And if I'm up a bit higher, it makes that mid-ground section quite large. So by bringing the tripod right down low, it makes that area quite low as well, or quite narrow, should I say, as well, which makes the image more dynamic, I think. Got these flows coming through the shot, which works really well. So having chosen the correct aperture setting, my next consideration is always motion, because this is such an important part of how the final image will look. Now, motion can mean several things. If we're shooting, say, handheld, it could be in the form of camera shake, which, unless it's intentional, we probably don't want. We may want to show motion in the final shot though, such as motion in water, clouds or other objects that are moving within the scene. If we do, then we have to decide on how much, which again comes back to the pre-visualization part. Because we've already pre-visualized the shot in our mind, we should know how we want the final outcome to look. So now it's just a case of working that out. For this shot, I want to show enough motion to show movement, but not so much as to turn the water into mush. So selecting the right shutter speed is critical for achieving not only the correct amount of motion, but also the proper exposure, which brings me straight on to point 4, the shutter speed. So to control motion and achieve the correct exposure, there are 3 tools that we can use if we've already decided on the aperture setting. Firstly, the shutter speed, then ISO, and finally filters. So if we change the shutter speed to achieve the correct exposure and take a shot, we can assess whether we need more or less motion blur. If we need more motion blur for the desired effect, it's because the shutter speed is too fast. To get a slower shutter speed, I just need to add a filter to reduce the amount of light reaching the sensor. The strength of the filter will depend on the current conditions and the available light. For example, in the middle of the day, you might want a 10-stop filter, whereas if it's dark, like in the woodland here, a 3-stop might be okay. In this instant, the circular polarizer is probably allowing me enough motion in the water without having to add a filter at all. So this is definitely going to vary depending on your current conditions. On the flip side, if you're seeing too much motion blur in your shot, then raising ISO will enable you to get a faster shutter speed, which will in turn give you less motion. Don't be afraid to raise your ISO, but it might be worth doing some test shots to see what you're comfortable with first with your gear. That means really I've just got the shutter speed to deal with next, and really the polarizer and the aperture and the ISO kind of dictating what shutter speed I've got currently. So at the minute it's about 1/10 of a second, which shows a little bit of motion blur. And I think I'm going to experiment with this a little bit to see if I can get that maybe a little quicker or maybe a little slower, just to see what that has an effect on the image overall. And I think what I want to show is just a little bit of motion blur, but I want sort of streaky patterns in the midground as well to accentuate that S-curve. So it's just a case of playing around with the shutter speed to get the desired look. But you need to know what the desired look is before you dial the settings in, or at least I do anyway. I find that much more helpful. So in the end, I just boosted my ISO a little bit just to quicken my shutter speed up to 1/15 of a second, because the water's running through here at such a rapid pace. You don't need a particularly slow shutter speed to be able to show some motion. If you've got too much motion, typically what ends up happening is the water just turns to like cotton wool or mush, and you lose all detail and texture in it. And I do like to show a little bit of detail and texture in my water, so I think it really shows the drama and the power of the conditions. So obviously these are just the steps that I use, which may differ from your approach, and that's absolutely fine. Everybody works differently, don't they? But if you're looking for a simple in-the-field workflow, then these steps help to keep things nice and simple. So yeah, pre-visualize the image, set the aperture for depth of field, choose the required shutter speed to control motion blur, and use either filters or ISO to achieve the desired shutter speed and correct exposure. Now, if you're looking to learn more about achieving the perfect exposure, I would highly recommend checking out the video that's up here somewhere where I delve into some powerful techniques. If you enjoy this video, please be sure to give it a like because that really helps me out. And if you'd like to stay up to date with future videos, why not consider subscribing? And if you would like to support the channel further, then why not consider checking out my zine or my current workshops? All of the proceeds go to help us reach in wonderful places such as this. Anyway, guys, until next week, take care, and I'll see you all very soon.